Well, yeah, thanks very much. So I'm going to just take you through a very kind of brief canter through the development of executive pay regulation in the UK over a fairly recent history. I'm only going to go back to like the early 1980s, not to the sort of 1850s or the 1780s or some of the other things that we've had earlier today. And executive pay regulation has been a slightly curious export industry for the UK. And I think that this sort of combination of disclosure and say on pay, which developed in the UK, has now become widespread across developed markets. And I'm going to talk not just about the development of that regulation, but how it interacted with the development of pay practices. And then I'll finish up by asking whether that's left us in a good place or not, and the clues in the title. So the story starts in 1984. Margaret Thatcher had just been re-elected for her second term off the back of the successful prosecution of the Falklands War, and was about to enter upon a period of liberalisation economically in the UK, including the liberalisation of financial services, the Big Bang in the city, and privatisation of public industries, and generally a kind of pro-business liberalised environment. And if we go back to 1984 at the start of all of this, I mean, what did executive pay look like then? And this is the sort of roughly what a chief executive's package in the FTSE 100 would have looked like at that time. Total package value of £200,000 sterling. It's about £600,000 in today's money. Overwhelmingly fixed pay. A salary, a hugely generous final salary pension, and then a little bit of bonus and maybe a few options on top of that. But 1984 was also the point at which actually the FTSE 100 started, 1st of January 1984, the top 100 companies in the UK. Over the subsequent kind of decade and a half, CEO pay increased by 6.5 percentage points per annum in real terms, whilst average wages increased significantly less. And this led to, along with various other corporate scandals, a growing sense of frustration around CEO pay. But what really lit the blue touch paper was the privatisation of public utilities. And the most famous example was British Gas. And in 1994, Cedric Brown, who was the CEO of the privatised British Gas company, received a 75% pay rise, taking his salary to £475,000. And unions got hold of a pig that was called, became named Cedric the Pig, dragged this pig around various sort of British Gas sites, sort of followed Cedric Brown wherever he went. And this became a kind of a national scandal that it was pigs in the trough, that these people, were suddenly getting paid 2, 3, 4 times what they'd been paid as bosses of publicly owned utilities. And this led to the launch of the Greenbury report. Now, because of various other public scandals around corporate governance in the UK in the late 80s and early 90s, there were some other kind of corporate governance studies that have been going on. So we'd had the Cadbury report, which was more around financial control and the financial aspects of corporate governance, said a little bit about remuneration, but Greenbury then came in the middle. I find this fascinating, actually, because I kind of think of the 1990s as kind of the modern era, but just look at this typesetting. I mean, and these reports have got typos in them. And when you look at the bodies, the body that was the study group, I mean, it's all Sir Bumpton Frumpton. I mean, they're all kind of white men. There's completely non-diverse. I mean, the world has really changed since these reports came out. But anyway, the Greenbury report, which was really the pay report, sat in the middle of this trio of major UK reports. So although Cadbury had talked about a little bit disclosure on executive pay, the idea of having independent remuneration committees, and limiting service contracts to 3 years. Anyone remember 5-year rolling contracts? I mean, blimey, I mean, things used to be pretty good for executives in some ways, didn't they? But Greenbury really focused in on this issue of remuneration, setting out a code of best practice, talking a lot about how remuneration committees should operate, recommending more detailed disclosure requirements, brought in this idea of long-term incentive plans with performance conditions, as opposed to just option plans for the first time, and actually talked about significantly limiting service contract terms. What was quite interesting was at this point, even at the point of the Hampel report, which followed it and brought both Cadbury and Greenbury together into the combined code, what became the UK Corporate Governance Code, even at the point of Hampel in the late 90s, say on pay was still being resisted by kind of the great and the good in the UK. It was still viewed as being an inappropriate intrusion of shareholder powers into the operation of the corporation. So by the time we'd got to the end of the 1990s, CEO pay had increased fourfold in nominal terms, and that's about 2.5 to 3 times in real terms. Largely, well, actually, pretty much every element of it increased across the board. I mean, I remember at the beginning of my career as a remuneration consultant, it was common for CEO salaries to increase at 8, 9, 10% per annum during that period. But also, long-term incentive plans, this great Greenbury innovation, of course, were introduced as an addition, not as a replacement for anything else. And so every element of the package had gone up at that point in time. And so, continued to have this frustration around executive pay in the body politic. But we were also starting to see this increased proportion of pay being performance related as well. We then had, the next phase, which I'm going to, I've called globalization, which was really, we had the merger boom of the late 90s, early 2000s, the irrational exuberance of the dot-com boom. And we had lots of CEOs going around talking about how they operated in this global market. They needed to be able to compete with the US. At the top, we've got Chris Gent, who was the CEO of Vodafone at the time, who they attempted to put together this globally oriented compensation philosophy, which basically meant paying the same as AT&T and the big US companies. And in response to this political problem around executive pay, there was this idea that, well, the problem is that actually shareholders don't have enough powers to control it. It was framed as a market failure, okay, rather than that was the sort of essence of how politicians defined it. And so they introduced say on pay in 2003 in order to try and give shareholders the tools to get on top of this problem of executive pay. And GSK famously lost the first one of these remuneration votes over the severance package for the CEO at JP Garnier. And in the first instance, investors used say on pay to pretty aggressively focus in on this Greenbury recommendation of cutting notice periods, first to 24 months and then to 12 months, but also requiring performance conditions on option schemes and LTIPs, making them tougher, removing this sort of retesting of performance conditions if they've been failed. But this did nothing for the level of pay, which increased 15% per annum in real terms over this period. So by the time we'd got to the just pre-financial crisis period of 2007, CEO pay had gone up another kind of threefold in nominal terms, twofold in real terms. But we've got this transformation now because this has all come largely through the explosion in performance-related pay. Pensions, if anything, have kind of come down a little bit because final salary schemes have been closed, tax rules have made them much less attractive, and we've now got this package that is overwhelmingly variable in nature, but has also become rather complex because the value of the package has been increased by layering new components on top. So deferred bonuses have been added to cash bonuses, options have been added to LTIPs, deferred bonus matching plans have been added to that. So there's this sort of growth in complexity. Then we have the financial crisis. Fred Goodwin, obviously massive scandal around Fred Goodwin's pension arrangements, and there was a loss of the remuneration vote for RBS, lots of remuneration issues around banks, causing regulators to intervene directly. And some of this actually bled out more into the wider corporate sphere. And there was still this sense that the political problem of executive pay had not been solved by giving shareholders more power, because ultimately the political problem around executive pay is around levels, not structure. So the political problem remained, and not taking account of Einstein's advice, the government decided, well, what we need is more shareholder powers to solve the problem of executive pay. So the binding vote was introduced towards the end of this post-crisis period. What is interesting, though, and that current regime now had some enhanced disclosure, but the fundamental change was that in addition to the advisory vote on implementation of remuneration policy, which is backward-looking, a binding vote was introduced on the structure of remuneration policy to apply for the future. And whereas under the old regime, say on pay with the advisory vote could just be ignored by companies if they lost it, the binding vote cannot be. And if you lose the binding vote, your pay policy is kind of sunk. So it's, this really gave shareholders teeth. What is interesting is that shareholders had already been using the advisory vote to bear down on escalation in executive pay, not levels in absolute terms, but really this sort of 8, 9, 10% per annum increases in salaries got completely squeezed out of the system over the post-crisis period. So what have we had? 2007 to 2015 actually didn't change very much. Okay, the structure of pay looked at a headline level roughly the same, but had become simplified. And actually, the levels of pay in real terms hadn't really shifted at all. So then we had our old friend Brexit. And following Brexit, Theresa May came in as Prime Minister with a pledge to end the burning injustices in UK society that had led to Brexit. Executive pay was kind of one of those that was cited. And there was this increasing focus on fairness in executive pay and on the relativity between CEOs and the wider workforce. So that led to introduction of pay ratios. It also led to investors using this binding vote power that they had to focus on areas that were perceived as egregiously unequal between CEOs and the wider population. So pensions was a famous example, and they used the binding vote to align pensions between CEOs and the wider population. And Bill Winters at Standard Chartered was an early victim of that. And actually, as a result of all of this focus, CEO pay actually declines during this period at around 3% per year in real terms. And people don't realize this. I mean, there's this narrative that CEO pay continues to escalate. And so if we look over the whole period, this is kind of what's happened in real terms to executive pay. We've had an explosion, a massive shift from fixed to variable, but actually subsequently a decline. And what's quite interesting is if you track that picture, so this is CEO pay, if you track that against what's happened to the size of companies, which grew massively initially, much faster than pay as a result of the merger boom, and actually if you allow for the increased risk in level of CEO pay, actually CEO pay is kind of not in a totally bonkers place in the UK compared to the growth in the size and complexity of companies that we've had over the period. But it is still seen as a massive political problem. And if you ask the average punter in the street, they would say that CEO pay is still escalating at a dramatic level, even though it's actually now declining in real terms. So what have we actually kind of achieved through all of this in the last 40 years? I mean, pay has definitely been transformed, and Say on Pay has played a role in that. And it's certainly played a role to enable this sort of agency model view of executive pay to become very, very dominant. So pay is now more variable in nature, very much based on shares, performance conditions. We've got malus, clawback, and so on and so forth. Joining and termination provisions have been made much more stringent. And actually, shareholders have imposed unrecognized pay restraints since the global financial crisis. But directors now report that these constraints are really biting in their ability to attract and retain executives. And I would say, in my experience, that's kind of true. Publicly listed companies now struggle to get their preferred candidates interested in the role compared with other opportunities they face, particularly in private companies. And Say on Pay has also led to this pressure on shareholders to adopt a sort of one-size-fits-all micromanagement of pay. But the political problem around pay is as toxic as it ever was. That has been far from solved by all of this Say on Pay. So I would say, arguably, we've kind of ended up in this worst of all worlds position through pay regulation, where we haven't solved the political problem, but we have placed sufficient constraints on the system to give directors genuine difficulties. That's me, done.